All right, everyone. I think we're just going to start, and then if people keep dripping in, we'll just let them in, and they can sort of come in late as the punishment for not being punctual. So thanks everyone for coming. This is obviously our third annual summer school that the Race in Britain project has put on, which is sort of a collaboration between a few different people and a project aimed at sort of discussing some of the issues relating to Britain's anti-racism that are often ignored, and sort of highlighting some of these themes. I guess the aim of today is to discuss Britain's anti-racist history, and that's kind of become a little bit more timely recently, following a lot of discussions about race, racism, resistance, and I think Britain's colonial past, which has sort of come to light in recent weeks. Our goal with these events is to create a space for discussion, a space for good faith discussion, not bad faith discussion. There's a lot of bad faith discussion, I think, out and about these days. So hopefully everyone comes at this with from a good, honest perspective. And yeah, as with some of our previous events, we're recording these. We're going to put these online at Race in Britain is the YouTube channel, where we've got some discussions already archived. And the goal is to continue sort of putting discussions online as a resource that people can access. And this is part of a sort of broader project that we work on, where we do a sort of 22-week supplementary curriculum on race, colonialism and class across two schools, one in East London and one in South London. So this project sort of feeds into that. And many of the speakers that have been kind enough, as they have today, to donate their labour and knowledge for this, have done so for free. So I want to reiterate, this is a volunteer-led project. So if you think it's rubbish, maybe bear that in mind, because this is a low-budget production, as you can probably tell. So yeah, this is part of the sort of broader project that we're working on to try and sort of discuss these issues and work with teachers and young people. So I'm going to introduce the speakers for the first panel, who I think you should be able to see on your screens, tech permitting. We've got Dr. John Narayan, who's a lecturer in European and International Studies at King's College, and is published widely on Britain's Black Power movement, I think it's fair to say. And then we've got Dr. Sita Balani. Sita is a lecturer in contemporary literature and culture, also at King's College London. Anyone would be fooled into thinking that King's College is some sort of hotbed for radical thinking, but I think you'd be sorely mistaken if that's what you were going to take away from this. But in Sita's research and teaching, she explores the relationship between imperialism and identity in contemporary Britain. And like I said, both of them have done quite a lot of work with this project, and like I said, donated their time to talk to some of the young people that we work with. So I'm going to hand it over now to John to sort of kick us off.
All right, so what I'm going to do for you guys is essentially go over the kind of history of British Black Power briefly. Let's start the conversation with what is the kind of conversation at the moment, which is the conversation around this term called BAME, right? So there's this conversation that we're having at the moment about the idea of BAME, right? This is a thing on the BBC website called Don't Call Me BAME. People are rejecting the term. And of course, BAME stands for Black, Asian and Minority Ethnic Communities. Some people don't know that. Some people don't know the A represents Asian, for example. We've moved from BAME from BME, which was Black and Minority Ethnic Communities. And in a sense, this is a weird debate to be having at this current moment, because everyone is into I'm not part of this homogenization. Don't put me into it. My experience as a racialized minority cannot fit all together. And I want to say, yes, that's wonderful. And we should agree with that, because BAME is actually a kind of management tool for anti-racism. But before we get into this disarticulation of this term, we want to get into the history of how this all turned up. And part of the research I've been doing for the last kind of 3 or 4 or 5 years now, as I get older, I forget how long it's been, is around the issue of Black Power and how British Black Power emerged in the mid-1960s. So Black Power emerges in the mid-60s in the US context with the kind of call from Stokely Carmichael for Black Power as a kind of implicit critique of the civil rights movements in the US. And that was just basically the argument that formal legal equality was never going to be good enough to secure the kind of justice for African Americans. What people, and you have big parts of this movement still with us. Angela Davis is everyone's hero. She's one of mine. But we have lesser figures known in Britain, although they're becoming more predominant now, such as the person you're going to have a breakout room session about, which is Olive Morris, right? And Britain has its own distinctive history of Black Power, right? Which emerges I think a year before it emerges properly in the US, but that's a scholastic debate. And essentially what this is a kind of anti-racist moment in Britain, which challenges the idea that, again, legal forms of equality or legal forms of just dealing with discrimination would solve the problems for ethnic minority communities that had come via what we call new Commonwealth immigration. And this was in the context of the emergence of Powellism, so Enoch Powell's kind of implicit post-colonial racism, which was England specifically, but Britain was a white place which really had no responsibilities to provide to its ex-colonies or its colonies it still had at the time. Neither should Britain have any truck with Europe as a political project, but that Britain should look to become a kind of figure that was isolated but part of a global economy. And part of Enoch Powell's kind of regime of talking about the rivers of blood post 68, which doesn't get talked about, is he was a free marketeer who believed in what we call neoliberal ideas, so shrinking the state, shrinking the idea that society actually had, that there was such a thing called society and that the state had a responsibility for other people. The British Black Power movement emerges in this kind of midpoint of the 1960s. Number of groups like the Universal Coloured People's Association, the British Black Panther movement, which is a lot of the documents here, the pictures you're seeing is from there, the Black Liberation Front, and the Black Unity and Freedom Party, all kind of emerge from the mid-60s to the early 70s, and they start to kind of really work together across an identity known as the Black Subject, which you linked all new Commonwealth communities. That was from Asia, from Africa, and the Caribbean. Not denying ethnicities, not denying specific racism suffered by groups, but bringing those groups together to deal what was with essentially a state regime of racism that treated all ex-colonies in not the same ways, but in very bad ways in particular. This was the kind of regime against what we call the emigration of coloured people to Britain. And it was also a kind of regime that pushed forward immigration controls, police brutality. All of these were seen as multiple points of anti-racist struggle. And these are some of the publications from the British Black Panthers. So you can see here linking anti-racism with just shop floor trade unionism. Unions in the mid-60s were inherently racialized places. The workplace was racialized, where black and brown bodies did the work specifically that white workers didn't want to do. Fighting off the immigration bill, right? So the Immigration Acts of 1962, 1968, 1971 in particular, were all framed around stopping coloured migration into Britain. And they were part of a strategy which was explicit from the British state from about 1945 onwards to keep Britain white. Again, this is about the immigration bill. And linked to all of this was the idea that anti-racist struggles against police brutality, against racism in education, against immigration and border control were also linked up with a anti-colonial struggle in what we used to call the Third World. And when we used to use that term, the Third World, we didn't used to mean it as a slur. It was a political project which was based around the emergence of national liberation struggles, but also national liberation struggles in Africa, Asia, Caribbean and Latin America, which were actually uniting together to try and create a new international economic order. And this is all playing out globally at that point, right? And part of this was linking those struggles. So you would link anti-racism against police brutality, against racist education, against border controls, with what was happening in apartheid South Africa, what was happening in Palestine, right? And you can see the links here. What was happening in Pakistan, what was happening in the Philippines. And this seems now kind of controversial to be saying, right? If you looked at the recent Black Lives Matter support for Palestine and all of the kind of hoo-ha that created around who should be supporting who and what, this was actually commonplace. Okay, what changes, right? So you have a kind of collective struggle, and I'm going to smooth over everything. So in the Q&A, we can get into the distinct of this. The British Black Power movement fades in the 1970s, but the next era, which Sita will talk about in the next segment of this panel, which includes the Asian youth movement, continued this form of anti-racist and anti-imperial struggle, linking the two together. By the early 80s and the emergence of Thatcher's government, what happens is essentially we have race riots across the UK, most famously in Brixton, but in other places all across the country, seen as urban rebellions, right? Urban rebellions because the youth are sick of structural racism, sick of structural class position, of their structural class position as particularly the underclass in British society. We have this discontent. You have the emergence of what is called the Scarman Report by Lord Scarman, which basically says that the problems with ethnic minority communities is not racism, but is actually their ethnic identity, their representation, and their kind of failure to kind of deal with the fact that they're now in Britain, right? So it shifts everything. And to cut a long story short, from the 1980s onwards, you end up with a kind of weird idea of what race relations or anti-racism should be is actually multiculturalism. So the kind of, fabled steel bands, samosas, saris and samosas, right? And everyone's all happy from the 1980s all the way through. Unbeknownst to all of that history, though, of course, it's the most important, one of the most important events in UK race relations, anti-racism, whatever you want to call it, of course, is the murder of Stephen Lawrence in 1993. And what this kind of showed was, although we had embarked upon policies where ethnic groups were splintered off, seen as kind of potential communities that you could fund, that you could co-opt, that you could bring into politics, right? Of course, the state racism and far-right racism didn't disappear from Britain. It continued, and this is probably the most famous case that some of our younger audience will know about. Stephen Lawrence's murder in 1993, which the perpetrators for that don't get prosecuted for another 25 years, but it leads to the idea that Britain has institutions which are institutionally racist. Why am I bringing all of this up? Well, that era of multiculturalism, which was still underpinned by state racism, disappears in 2001. Quite famously in Oldham, Bradford and Burnley. This is before 9/11 and the emergence of kind of rampant Islamophobia that now runs through Britain's state. But in a sense, there was an idea that Britain's multicultural settlement disappeared in 2001. This, in some ways, is the context for the emergence and kind of use of BME and BAME. And this is the reason I've gone through this history. BME and BAME are part of management tools linked to multiculturalism, which essentially want to create forms of representation rather than real anti-racist change. So we'll have debates around whether we have enough brown or black people, and specifically in this instance, black people at Oxford, but we'll not really talk about their class background, and we'll not really talk about the fact that Oxford and Oxbridge is itself a class structure which dominates Britain, right? So you can have forms of representation, but you cannot have real structural change linked to that prior history from the 60s and 70s I was talking about. And of course, the embodiment of this is the face of evil known as Priti Patel. Right? Normally, I think we get a few laughs about that, but she is inherently the representative of this moment where you have a category of management for anti-racism, where you position certain minorities vis-a-vis other minorities. We then have an argument around Priti Patel's anti-blackness or her failure to understand racism. She can then say, well, people called me a Paki, and we have a weird debate that individualizes racism away from the structures of the state which legitimate forms of racism, right? And this is important today because the Labour leader apparently is going to have unconscious bias training, but he's not going to change the judicial system or the political system if and when he gets into power. And this is all really important because the present moment, of course, has pushed anti-black racism and racism right to the fore, both in the US and of course in the UK, right? And we've had our moment with Edward Colston falling into the sea. What does this mean though? In a sense, the rejection of defunding the police have to go back, and they are rooted in a history which is not around terms like BAME, it's not around terms like BME and managing the demands of anti-racism, but actually they are located in the histories of the 1960s and the 1970s, which is a link between race, class, and imperialism. The link between those things and what the state does. How do we change the state? How do we change the economy? How do we change the way we live, rather than putting various faces in high places, whether they be black, brown, or the full spectrum? And this in Britain is linked to the current moment, because we are living in a form of, we're living in the midst, not the aftermath. The government thinks it's the aftermath of the COVID-19 crisis, which has exposed how racism and state structures in our economy essentially create forms and lives for ethnic minorities, which in the current moment has just led to death, right? If you're Bangladeshi, if you're from the Afro-Caribbean community, if you're from the British Pakistani community, then your fate as a key worker and a key role in the British economy was likely to be underpaid, undervalued, and also to have a likely death. But don't worry, we all clap for everyone on Thursday. It's all fine. And this is probably best brought together in the tragedy that is Grenfell, right, which we marked 3 years of recently, where we saw a state structure which doesn't care for its citizens, doesn't care for the racialized experiences of its citizens, and bringing those struggles together is, in a sense, part of the prior anti-racist history that we have. And of course, the internationalism that links those things together. This is George Floyd on a wall that separates Israel and Palestine. Why is this important? Let's go back to this BAME thing. So I've seen lots of things saying, I'm not part of this group. And I agree, we shouldn't be part of this group. But neither are we all just competing ethnic minority identities, looking for funding, looking for positions. We all experience racism in different ways from the subgroups that we belong to. But in a sense, state racism is state racism. We must join together and work together on some of these issues. They'll create difficult conversations with different communities, but our history is one of working together. And the reason I'm going to say this is, it's impossible to solve some of these issues without working together. And I'll just want to give you a last example before I hand over to Sita, which I think is indicative of the history of British anti-racism, which is very good at doing this. And this is the current platforms that we're all on. All of us are on either laptops or mobiles, right? Linked to a global commodity chain. And so this is the kind of global commodity chain that underpins an iPhone or a Mac or pretty much near anything else that's created these days in electronics. And what you'll see on this map is Europe and the US are places where people buy stuff. China is also somewhere where you buy stuff, but there's a global production network that links everyone together. From the devaluing of Black life in the Democratic Republic of Congo, where child labor is used to kind of get the cobalt and tungsten, which is key to the batteries that run in all of these things, which is then shipped over to China, where exploited workers in Foxconn factories, where they have to essentially put suicide nets on the side of the building to stop workers committing suicide from the amount of exploitation that happens in these buildings, are then put together, normally quite cheaply. The worker is paid very little, and then shipped over to the advanced economies, where you and I go into debt to buy these things, even though we really should be able to provide these goods at much cheaper prices. You and I go into debt or sell off our right arm to buy one of these things, and must have the latest gadget as we're stuck in a cycle of commodity. So in some ways, we should reject things like BAME, which are management tools, but we mustn't reject the forms of anti-imperialist solidarity, which keep us bound together and should force us to both examine our relationships with one another and also those beyond our borders. And I'll just end with this quote by everyone's favorite anti-racist author. And I think this is about the history of British anti-racism that we all have to kind of keep in stead. And this is from Sivanandan, who was the leader, de facto leader of the Institute of Race Relations, and a wonderful anti-racist British scholar, my favorite British Marxist. And he writes a piece where he says, and he's talking about the history of the working class movement and how anti-racism must reflect to that. He says, there are still values and traditions that have come down to us from the working class movement: loyalty, comradeship, generosity, a sense of community, and a feel for internationalism, and an understanding that unity has to be forged and reforged again and again, and above all, a capacity for making other people's fights one's own, all the great and simple things that make us human. So in some ways, I'll just end with, I think the best thing about British anti-racism history and why we should recover it and use bits of it and get rid of other bits is it's a process of all making us human in a struggle for all of our liberation.
Yeah, that was brilliant, John. Thanks. I'm sure everyone's doing a really loud round of applause, and I'm sure people laughed at pretty clever when she came on the screen. So Sita, are you there? Are you with us?
Hi everyone. Thanks so much for the invitation. I feel like the Consented Summer School and the Consented Youth Projects have been like one of the best things to emerge in the last few years, and I always feel really grateful to get an invite and to be able to come and chat to you. Obviously a bit disappointed not to be there in person because it's always really enjoyable and useful for me to chat to people after the event, but maybe we can find a way to recreate that online now. So Amit asked me to talk about what we can learn from the Asian youth movement. So I said to him that from the looks of the streets in the last month or so, young people in Britain have already learned all that, and that maybe they can kind of, they're already taking that further in many ways. But I also realised after saying that actually what we're seeing at the moment with these protests, which have been really beautiful and amazing, I think it's important to tell the difference between what they are and what kinds of struggle we're going to need to produce from them. So I think what we're seeing at the moment, we might think of as a mobilisation rather than a movement. And so one of the things I think we can learn from the Asian youth movements is how to turn that mobilisation into a movement. So how to go from thousands on the street, which is really exciting and offers us a lot of potential, to something that is capable of making real change to the society we live in. Something that's capable of building power, of taking power back from the state, of challenging state power, and of changing people's lives in a material way in the day-to-day. So changing the education system, changing what we think of as justice, changing the kinds of work people do and how they get paid for that work, changing people's access to like life chances, to viable futures, to dignity, to respect, to community. So I think like at the moment we're seeing this great, beautiful outpouring of possibility, but now it's like, what do we do with that possibility? And I think the Asian youth movements have got something to tell us about that. So I'm going to talk about them a little bit. I'm going to focus on money, and I'm going to talk about how I've used the lessons I've learned from like reading their archive and looking at what they did in my own organising. So the Asian youth movements were formed at the end of the 1970s, and they continued in various forms until the end of the 1980s. There were Asian youth movement groups in Manchester, Sheffield, Southall, Tower Hamlets, Burnley, Haringey and Bolton. So sort of dotted around the country, a couple of groups in London, also in the north. So concentrated in places where there were significant South Asian communities. And they formed in response to various forms of racial and class oppression. So immigration raids and immigration controls more generally, so deportation, as well as dawn raids on people's houses, aggressive forms of border control, were all things that were formative of Asian communities in Britain at that time, and obviously continue to be. We're also seeing the rise of the far right, so the National Front was on the march and gaining in power. We saw the murder of Gurdeep Singh Chagga, a young Sikh boy in Southall in '76, which was one of the catalysts, one of the key catalysts for the movements to start. And then we also saw everyday forms of police harassment, so similar to what we see now, and which continue in working class areas in this country. And then also really significant racism in employment and education. So like very serious high levels of unemployment and long-term experiences of racism in the education system. So you might think also about the history of busing as important to this. So there's a lot of chat about the system of busing in the US that created segregated schools. And we saw something similar happen here. So a process by which it was decided that having too many Black or Asian kids in a school was going to be bad for that school. But The way around that was that Asian kids were bused to other schools to keep them in low numbers. So no white kids were ever bused. It was only ever Black and Asian kids that were bused. And that meant that the young Asian kids who started the Asian youth movements had an experience of racism in schools without very much in the way of redress to institutional forms of justice. So, put simply, if you went and told the teacher about that, nothing would happen. That's what most kids found out. And now maybe some of you have had similar experiences in school, even though many decades have passed since then and to now. But that experience meant that those groups of kids really learnt to work together, really learnt to fight back together, and to organise themselves in very everyday ways to fight against that racist treatment, both at the hands of their peers and at the hands of the teachers. And so I think that, and so the youth movements in these different areas came out of those experiences of economic exploitation and marginalisation, of poor treatment in the education system, of immigration controls, of policing, and crucially of really high unemployment. I think there are loads of lessons in struggle here. I'm going to focus on one that I think has not been discussed enough in our movements in the current moment, and that's about money. So how do we organise and think about money when we are doing political work? How do we manage the question of paying for things, of making sure people have access to the things that they need, and of paying for people's labour? I think it's a big live question at the moment. So I want to talk through what the Asian youth movements did about that question. Now, in the Bradford youth movement, almost every single one of the young people involved in that group was unemployed. Almost everyone was on the dole, on job seekers. But they needed someone to coordinate that movement. They needed someone to coordinate that group. And what they all did is they all put in a little bit of their dole every week. And that money went to one guy in the movement who was going to coordinate. So he wasn't the boss, he wasn't in charge. He was there to do some of that work in the day-to-day, because everyone else was also looking for a job and so on. But they all put in a little bit of money so that he was going to have some kind of an income, because he couldn't be on the dole if he was doing this job. And what they did is they put in enough money so that he would get the same amount as they all got on job seekers allowance, right? So he did not, coordinating this project, make any more money than anyone else who was involved. They also put in a little bit extra to pay for a phone line, and that phone line was one that they were all able to use. Now that, when we all walk around with a phone in our pocket, maybe seems like a kind of hard thing to imagine, but if you imagine what we need as forms of collective resource will change from moment to moment, from era to era, and at that point it was a phone line. Now it might be something else, right? So now maybe it would be a laptop, a printer, and a space to work. And everyone involved had access to that space. And so I think, and in Southall, so that was in Bradford, and in Southall they took a slightly different approach, and they needed a space, a physical space to use to organise. And what they did was they took the upstairs room of a building owned by a local businessman, and he wanted to kick them out, but he felt scared to, because he knew that they had good standing. They were protecting the community, and so he knew that if he turfed them out of his business, that would cause a lot of ripples, and he didn't want his own reputation to be damaged by that. So he decided to let them keep that space. So they saw they needed a resource, and they took it from within the community, right? Now, in both of those groups, both in Bradford and in Southall, there was an attempt by the state to infiltrate and to manage those groups. So what John was just talking about with the idea of BAME as a form of management, we saw that also with the uses of money as a form of management. So state funding was given to both of these projects. Now, in Bradford, that money paid for that coordinator and it paid for that phone line. It also started to pay for people to take buses to deportation hearings. Now, prior to that money being given to them by the state, people would all put in cash for their seat on the bus, and they'd hire a bus, and everyone would get on the bus together and go down to London for a deportation hearing. Now, once the state started paying for that, they started to notice that fewer and fewer people came down on the bus. Now you'd think, right? I think you'd think it was the other way around. You would expect that people would, if a seat was already paid for them, they didn't have to pay for them, they'd be more likely to get on the bus. But in fact, the opposite was true. When people had to fundraise within their own communities to go and do something, then they were always more inclined to do it. They were almost always more invested in the project. The same with the paying for the coordinator role. One of the things that people found was that people felt less invested in the project because they hadn't then participated in bringing together the resources to get it off the ground. So I think we can learn something here about the way that it's not just the imposition of language that can start to demobilize radical movements. It's also the flooding of those movements with money. Now, I think what we're seeing at the moment is that it's really possible to bring together, to fundraise a lot of money online, right? You can make a crowdfunder and it can be incredibly successful. And there's a lot of value in that. There's a lot of potential in that, I think. But I think there are also limitations. So I'm just going to give you an example of how I've tried to think about this in my own organising. So I think sometimes there's a temptation to make a little crowdfunding page and put it up immediately and try and bring that money together. I do think sometimes that works. But recently, as the COVID-19 crisis hit, lots of people started setting up mutual aid groups to try and support people in their local areas. And my area was no different. And so we set up a little group. Now, I live in a bit of London that's probably not dissimilar to bits of London that maybe some of you live in, which is really divided on class lines. So you can have regular social housing, tower blocks, or low-rise social housing, very mixed communities in them. And then one road over, there can be houses worth £2-3 million. One road over, social housing again. You might find all kinds kind of in the same area, because we don't have that form of, the way that social housing segregation work in Britain is very different to how it works elsewhere, for example, in the US. So people often live in very mixed communities. And so we set up a little group to try and get people there shopping, just my road, another road over, and sort of 2 roads that connect them, probably 3,000 houses, maybe not even that. And one of the things that we tried to do was to see what we could do with this group in terms of redistributing money within the community. So we put together a little pot of money and ensured that everyone's shopping was bought out of that money. So whether or not, if you could afford to, you would then donate the money for your shopping, and if you couldn't, you wouldn't, and no one would ever check, right? So all of the shopping would be done out of that pot. And one of the reasons for this was an attempt to say, we're all responsible for each other's well-being. We're all responsible for making sure our neighbours have what they need. And in an area that's quite mixed, some of that, from my perspective, was about doing a little bit of Robin Hooding, right? Making sure that people in the area with more money, that some of their money was redistributed to people in the area with less money. And so we put together a little account for that. And I know that I could have tweeted that and more people would have given money from outside the area. But there's also, I think, something worthwhile in trying to do things on a very local level. So one of the things that I learned from learning about the Asian youth movement is the value of organising on the level of the neighbourhood, is the value of organising on the level of your street and the next street, and thinking about what you can do in that very local way. And I think thinking about money differently might help us to do that. So at the moment, there's this big call that says, you should pay me for my labour, people should pay people of colour for their labour, and I understand that. But if I'm going to go on a panel that's about organising, I don't need to get paid for that, because I see that as part of my work. I see that as part of the work of pushing for liberation. Now, that doesn't mean that no one should get paid for it, but it does mean that we should think first and foremost about levelling everyone up, right? Making sure that we start to redistribute that money within the community so that we're not creating individuals that get paid for their labour. We're improving everyone's living conditions, everyone's working conditions together, not starting from the point of view of one person doing well out of something, but starting from the point of view of how do we make sure that everyone has things that they need. And so I think often it's really tempting to think about money and the movement as if we had more money, we'd have a bigger, better rowdier, more radical movement. In fact, I think we need to start from the other direction and start thinking about how do we build structures that can manage that? How do we build structures that can redistribute that money? How do we build structures so that everyone can contribute their labour and everyone can build the movement together? And so I'll leave it there, but I do think that one of the lessons from the Asian youth movement is that if you remain independent financially and socially from the state, that you don't allow the state's language, but also the state's money to buy you off, to co-opt what you're doing, then that allows for you to have the autonomy and the independence to respond to the needs of your community and also to fight the state. I think that the temptation is always to take the money when it's there, and sometimes I think there's a value in pausing and thinking, what do we really need and how can we, will money help us build a movement for liberation or will it not? And so I'll leave it there, but maybe we can talk more about that in the Q&A. Thanks, everyone.
All right, brilliant. Yeah, John, can you put your camera on? Yeah, you've done it. All right, wicked. So has anyone got any questions they want to just chuck in the chat? But don't like barrage the chat because I have to like sift through it, and yeah, it's a bit long if there's too many questions at once. So yeah, who wants to get the party started with a question or a thought or a comment? Or all of the above. There's lots of thank yous. Thanks, Sita. Thank you, Sita. You're amazing. Another one. Lots of food for thought. I don't know, John, have you got a question?
I tell you, me and Sita have done that. We've already had a rehearsal of this. We could do something similar if there's no questions.
I know there's a question. So what happened with the Robin Hood approach? Did people redistribute wealth from
yeah. I think in some ways it's really worked. So just in my like few roads, there's probably been like £3,000 or £4,000 worth of like money redistributed through shopping and errands, basically. So like we've got a little pot of money through a platform called Open Collective. I'll find the link and put it in the chat before the end of the session. And people have been donating, but also sometimes people just do someone else's shopping out of their pocket, and if they can afford to not collect their expenses back, then they just don't, and that's another way of donating. But one of the things that I've been kind of like, when I've been coordinating on the phone, I've been making sure to do is to never present anything as charity, because I think we've all got into this mindset about charity, and I think we have to like try and sort of chop that and try and come up with a different way of imagining how we look after each other. And so one of my neighbours, her freezer broke, and when she tried to sort it out, it like short-circuited the power in her building, so it's like really, really broken, actually quite dangerous. The council weren't doing anything about it, they didn't come and check the electric, so she was there with her kids, no freezer. And what we did was put out a little message saying, hey, one of our neighbours, her freezer's broken, is anyone able to help out? And I said, and there's 150 people in this WhatsApp group. I said, there's 155 of us in this WhatsApp group. If everyone put in a quid, we'd be able to buy her a new freezer today. And I think that actually, that really simple idea of doing a whip round, basically, like people understood that immediately. You don't have to have like kind of class consciousness to understand the logic of everyone puts in a quid and then our neighbour has a new freezer. It's a very simple idea, but I think actually doing it really made a difference, right? Because it made a difference to this person's life because now she's got house sorted again. It also made a difference because people understood themselves to be responsible for other people's well-being, like not as charity, just in the way that like everyone can imagine their freezer breaking. So that really helped, I think. So yeah, for me, that was just like a good thing for me to learn. And in a way, I was also trying to be honest, to like slightly manipulate my white liberal neighbours into feeling responsible. Because everyone, when all this kicked off, it was like, oh, what should we do to help the poor? And like, actually, there was like, you can't change people immediately. You can't tell them that they're wrong, but you do have to start like creating structures so that they're forced to start thinking of themselves a little bit differently. So I don't know if it works or not, but
okay.
Yeah.
Sorry, I was going to say excellent. There's been an absolute like barrage of questions that have just come in, and I've been trying to write them down. So what a couple of them relate to this, and yeah, so there was a real vigorous chat that was developing in the chat a minute ago. So are there any alternatives that people can use instead of BAME? What would be, someone's also put, I'm currently working with Black-led groups that are actively rejecting BAME term. How do we support their position and transform to a new model for future working? What is the future of BAME, basically? Yeah.
The future. Oh, you want me to go? Cece, do you want to frame the future of anti-racism? No? No? I think there's two things here, right? There's reject the term for what it is, which is a state management term. And I think people are right to do that. But what people are falling into the trap of, in my opinion, is people are falling into a weird trap of where they reject the term, but then still take on the kind of rationality of what the term was supposed to do, right? So you'll see groups competing, especially on places like Twitter, but also actively in other circles where there's like an oppression Olympics about who's the most oppressed, when actually we need to start framing our analysis to look at how Sivanandan has a wonderful line. He says, racism doesn't stop moving, just like imperialism doesn't stop moving. And in a sense, we need to keep working with how modern racism is shifting and changing and what it's doing. So that would be the rationality. I'm not sure about what term you would come up with. I mean, I'm not sure we need a new term. I think we just need to have the empathy of getting together and understanding how state racism works and identifying with each other's struggles. And the only thing I would say this is if you don't do that, if we don't work together, and I think the Black Lives Matter movement at the moment has been really good at doing this. It's mobilized people, and people are getting educated through their activism together. If we don't keep that up, and I think what Sita was getting at, what we'll end up is we'll have lots of demonstrations, and we'll have Keir Starmer's wonderful moments, but we won't have movements, right? And we need movements that can build and organize and create institutional change. So I'm not sure we need a new term. I'm definitely not. So when I do this history, there's always this weird political blackness debate, which I saw happening in the chat. And I'm just like, look, that term's done. That's part of history, whatever. But we recover the elements of solidarity and working together. So I'm not sure we need a new term to bring us all together. I think anti-racism is the correct term to bring us all together, as we all are anti-racist.
Sia, have you anything to add to that?
Yeah, I would just say that I think we have to be honest about the fact that if all of our focus is on language, then what we end up with is we miss the fact of whether or not you're using language in a good faith or a bad faith way. So what you said at the beginning of it about like we're here to have like a good faith discussion is like we have to be honest about the fact that if all of our focus is on language, what it does is it's very gameable. Language is very gameable. Language is very exploitable. It can be used to multiple different ends, right? So that's why we can see the Priti Patels of this world manipulate terms, because a language without a movement to back it up, it's always going to be used against us. So the language matters, but the language matters as an expression of the force of our movement. So we're going to have to create that force if we want to be able to use language in a way that builds power for us. Otherwise, language on its own, we can have the best language on its own, we can have the best analysis on its own, we can be the smartest people, we can have the best understanding of racism, we can have the most like finely grained, beautiful analysis, but ultimately, we've got to build some power to make our analysis matter. And without that power, it doesn't matter. So I think that's we can't focus too much on the language at the expense of the power.
So yeah, Sita, there's been a few questions about the mutual aid. So I'm just going to wrap them all into one and just see if you wanted to share some thoughts. Someone's put, can you explain the logistics of how the pot started from start to finish? I think that might be beyond the scope of the Q&A, but like maybe a brief point on that rather than a full-on financial outline might be quite good for people. And someone else said, do you think there'll be long-term effects of this mutual aid in your community? And then there's a couple of questions that are linked. So one is, do you know if this has worked in predominantly white working class areas? And do you know if there's been anything similar in black areas? So that's like, I've thrown in like loads of questions there. Sorry.
Yeah, I mean, the putting the money together, the hardest part was logistics. Plenty of people wanted to donate and plenty of people needed things. We just needed like a way to kind of make that happen. And there was this platform called Open Collective. I've put the link to it so you can see how that works. It's really simple, so you can just like look at that and get a sense of it. Worth noting that when we started this, like bare tech companies started coming to pitch us. I felt like I'd become one of the dragons in Dragon's Den, because people kept calling and being like, I've made an app, and I was like, this is very weird. So like, as a kind of words of warning, the moment you start doing anything in your community, your phone does not stop ringing, partly with really good stuff and partly with complete nonsense. So you've got to learn very quickly to filter like what's useful and what's nonsense, and a lot of it's nonsense. In terms of where people are doing this, every community ever has had a way of doing this, certainly every working class community ever. So whoever mentioned the partner in the chat, that's absolutely an example of everyone putting in every month, and then a different person gets the pot each time. So Caribbean communities have been doing that for a long time, and that comes from a tradition from West Africa that has its own roots there and that was kind of taken to the Caribbean and now exists here. Like South Asian communities have done that for a long time, white working class communities have done that for a long time in different forms. It might not have a word in each place, but like it's a very kind of conventional idea in a way. So I think that one of the things that's powerful about it is that it accepts that having money is not because you did the right thing. Like that there's a little bit of randomness, that you're born into the situation you're born into, that things like just kind of, so that the idea that we're all responsible for each other's well-being is partly the idea that if things are working out for you, that you're responsible for someone who things aren't working out for, because also one day you might be in the other position, and so mutual aid rather than aid is useful for that. So I think this is happening all over the place, and in some places it's definitely had like a more like neighborhood watch character that I think we've got to try and stamp out. And like I don't live in an area that's like super radical. It's really, really mixed, and on some level I don't know how much like real political education we've done with some of these like wealthier people, but we have taken the money out of their pocket and put it in other people's pockets, and I think that's kind of worthwhile on its own. In terms of shouldn't we be lobbying the state, I think this is the thing. Yes, we should, but we have to do it in terms that don't constantly give over our movements to the state. And so sometimes I do think it is better that everyone puts in the pound rather than everyone emails local council. Sometimes I do think that builds a kind of power that you just can't build in any other way. But if anyone has any other questions about mutual aid or is doing their own mutual aid organising and wants to chat about it, like please get in touch.
Wicked. There's two questions that I think are kind of related. One is, should there be more diversity and inclusion roles within organisation? And then I think related, someone's put, what do you think of positive discrimination schemes? So has anyone got any thoughts on that? I'm sure you do. I'll pass over to John because Sita's been waxing lyrical for a while now, so might need a break.
Okay. Yeah, so you can take a break. Okay, positive. Let's start with positive discrimination. Yes. I mean, I'm quite honest about it. I would, but that has to be linked up to what we're trying to achieve, right? So like what I was trying to get at in the talk is, listen, there's nothing that stops us as brown, black, whatever people involved in anti-racist struggle, essentially being good people. There's like, for those of us who live with other brown and black people in neighborhoods or grew up, you know, there's when you get to, I give you an example, when you get to like a really white middle class institution, minorities become novelties of experience. Like you're with your colleagues and they talk about minorities as if they're like different from other human beings, right? And so they're not, because we know that. And most of the people we dislike in our personal lives will be of a non-white hue, just because, you know, normally you don't like your family as much, right? So we know that there's nothing normatively wonderful to us just as people. That's just, you know, we are all flawed and whatever. So yes, bringing more people in, but the point of anti-racism is to deal with institutional structures, laws, and practices. And if that's not part of that strategy, if it's not about, I mean, we could talk about dismantling, but changing those structures, changing those institutional practices, then actually we may be doing more harm than good. We may be creating people who want to then become part of the state, and you can see that in some of the kind of minority Tories. Or we may even end up causing harm to people, you know, like I moved from working in a very predominantly working class BME academic community to shifting into a more white middle class one. And it's been all right for me, but that could be traumatic for some people. So we have to understand what it is that we're doing with our positive discrimination, because I'm not sure just putting more of us on shop floors really changes institutions, but people may disagree with that. And the first question, what was the first question? Not positive discrimination.
More diversity and inclusion.
Yeah, so diversity and inclusion is a classic tactic of, it can either be good or it can be really, really, really bad. You know, some of us maybe on this call have had experiences trying to push those agendas through on certain things, and maybe getting things get lost in different things. And then it also about the kind of labor of who does this stuff, right? Is diversity and inclusion to be left to people who look like me or Sita or some of our Black colleagues? Whose role is it to do this? So none of these things are easy. There are no easy answers. They are like a bit like what Sita was talking about when working in the community. It's not like, you know, this is the right way. There'll be different strategies in different ways. I mean, I'm always wary of issues around diversity and inclusion because I'm not sure really why, you know, in meetings. All right, I'll give you an example. I was in a meeting once and they were talking about all the diversity and inclusion strategies they could do. And then the head of it turned to me and went, and we can focus on the BAME attainment gap. And I was like thinking, why are you saying that at me? And I was like, oh, I'm the only non-white person in the room. So of course, like, I could focus on the BAME attainment gap, right? So we have to be worried about what the management, just like the state, what they do with these initiatives.
I think on the diversity point, I think it's always really worth remembering that is a way that the institution is trying to manage its own problems. Yeah. So they are trying to manage the potential that we might not take it anymore. So the diversity and inclusion is a way to try and stop dissent, not to try and change the institution. And I think it's often we take it because we feel like it's all we're going to get, but actually there is always the potential to say like, no, thank you. I don't know that that's the solution here. And I think it also always puts the emphasis back on us. Like, what are we doing? How are we going to change? So I'll take that example of the attainment gap that John just mentioned. So in universities, it's like long-standing that everyone that there's some disparity with the grades that white and non-white students graduate with, right? We've seen this. Now, I think the problem begins when we call it an attainment gap, right? So it assumes that the problem is with the attainment of the student. What if it's not that? What if we have an awarding gap? What if the problem is with the structures through which we give out grades? What if we didn't give out grades? What if we gave out grades really differently? What if that was a totally different approach? But if you call it an attainment gap, it's like, how do we change what the Black and brown students are doing? How do we change the BAMEs, you know? And it's like, well, actually, there's another option here. We could say, how do we change the institution so that we give out grades differently? And every time you mention this, the whole institution melts. Like, everyone loses their minds. And what you see is that they're really invested in the way the institution currently works. So I think every time you can like shine the light back on what's the institution doing, do it.
Yeah, no, I had a very similar experience in a meeting like Sita had, where we were talking about how the attainment gap, and someone said, oh, you know, the students fail to kind of adapt to the culture at the university. And I made everyone silent by going, well, maybe the culture at the university is racist. And then we had like a pause for a minute, and then we moved on, right? So it's a very kind of, you have to tread a line with this, especially working in an institution.
I'm going to link that into the next question and I'm going to expand it out. So the question is, how would you best advise teachers to cultivate an anti-racist ethos in their classroom and at school? But I guess you could expand that out to also include university. How can you foster an anti-racist ethos in the university class, in the seminar room, in the Zoom chat, as it is these days? So what do you guys think about that?
I think that punishment. I think that the first thing to do is cut ties to the police. So if you've got a school police officer, if you have the Met Police or the other local police force come around and like do your little talk about whatever youth violence, chop it. Use that time, use that money to do something else. Use that time to have someone come in and do a talk about mental health. If you've got a prevent officer in the school, I guarantee that money would be better off spent on something else. Probably education, probably books, probably resources, probably iPads. So like just getting rid of all the structures of punishment that have been woven into education. If you find out how many exclusions happened last year at your school, the next year the aim for how many exclusions should be 0. And that needs to be made clear from the other students, and that needs to be made clear from teachers. I understand I'm saying this as someone who doesn't work in a school. I work in a university, so we have a different set of structures. But I do think at least raising the starting point as not being changing the curriculum, but being like getting rid of the violent structures of the state in the classroom. Because I think what really scares me with all this chat about changing the curriculum, if we have a really radical anti-imperialist curriculum in a school where like the police are always there, there's metal detectors on the way in, like black kids are treated like criminals on the way to prison, at the same time as we have this radical education in the classroom, in the materials, all we're doing is creating a massive cognitive dissonance where you're literally told one thing and the complete opposite happens. Like, I don't want to put loads of kids through that. I have to say, I think that would be like extremely dangerous. So from my perspective, we begin from the big stuff, the big structures, and we never do anything that just changes content at the expense of changing those other things. So that would be my suggestion.
Yeah, I was just going to chip in there as well, because we're designing like a 6-week unit on anti-racist history in Britain, so I guess say British civil rights, for a school in South London, which all the year 9s in the school will have to take. And part of me is like, oh, it's great, and it is kind of cool, but like there's a lot of questions to be asked about like the way in which you have to like even get information across. Like, it's a history unit, so it's all about factors. Which factor was most significant in the decline of the National Front? And like, you know, like those sort of exercises you have to push through. So I think there's obviously something to be said about even just the way in which you have to like the way in which education is structured, and also just like being a bit honest about the fact that like it's only 6 weeks and it's not really going to change their lives like that drastically. I don't remember what I took when I was doing my Key Stage 3. So I think it's more like, rather than just like these little bits, which I think we're going to start seeing now, because there is a bit of scope on some curriculums to make small changes. It needs to be like much more widespread, and also about who's going to do best in those exams anyway. Like looking at those histories, it's like certain type of student will do better and will perform better and will be able to do those tasks better. So we need to maybe rethink like the whole way in which we do education and the way in which we administer tests and things like that. But yeah, that's just my tuppence, as they say, just chiming in.
No, I mean, you're doing the work. I know that sometimes that then requires me to come and do some work, but you're doing the work, right? No, I think these are all really important points, and we shouldn't paint this like crazily. So I think like the curriculum changes that will turn up, like they'll be superficial, but some of them will be like small victory. Like, you know, they're going to be history courses at university running stuff on like Black British history for the first time ever next year, I can tell you. Right, and it's a tragedy that they've had to do this, and some of these people won't have the expertise in doing it, right? Like, let's be honest. But like that, it's even appearing, I will take as some small victory. And I think Sita's right. We start with the institutional foundations, and we try and destroy them as best as we can. Whether we can or not is a totally different issue. But you know, even in a university, it was really interesting. Even in a university as ours, you know, which people think is a very white, right of center, heading off towards the Ministry of Defense kind of university. You know, my actual experiences are with really good people. There are pockets of spaces and times that you can do anti-racist stuff, And if you're a student heading there, because I'm aware that we may have students on the call, and we don't want to just paint out that they're going to have a horrible time at university. There are spaces where you can find anti-racist activity, anti-racist knowledge. And I'm just going to flip this. I'm going to just say something like, I think I didn't come across anti-racism at school until I was, in GCSE, kind of heading into A-level. And I just remember being really pissed off once I started to hear about stuff. And so, not to upplay the curriculum stuff, I'm quite happy that young working class brown and black people could be more pissed off at school, because that may also be a catalyst for change. And I think one of the things that you should do in a classroom is whatever structural change you can do, try and bring the students into having a say and part of that structural change, if that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. So we got a really good question, but it got like lost in the sea. So I was really gonna ask, how do we sustain the momentum of the movement at the moment for institutional change? Where do you see inroads for long-term change coming, if at all? I added the if at all.
I think, like, I going to a couple of the demos and just seeing, like, I imagine it's many of you on the call who are involved in doing stuff like this, but like seeing the numbers of people, but also seeing the kind of discipline of it, I was really amazed. I was really rated that. Like the March for Shukri Abdi, it was like thousands of young people, mostly non-white crowd, and like people moved at pace through the city, and it was really exciting. And I think that the physical momentum of being on the street, like we take that feeling of like the collective and the excitement, and then we have to kind of hold that feeling and use it to do other things. So I think some of it is about sustaining ourselves, and I think that momentum of these protests, what's really important is that we think about that feeling of being on the street with other people, and we try and use that feeling in the other kinds of work. So because it's that feeling that gets you through doing the boring admin, or like trying to photocopy 700 flyers on your lunch break at the work computer. Like it's that feeling of collectivity that you've had. And I think that thousands and thousands of people at the biggest anti-racist protests in British history, that's a lot of people who've got that feeling now. And so like I could talk to you for ages about the negatives, but I feel very positive about that. I feel like that feeling in and of itself is the potential.
No, I'll just chime in. I think the momentum will have to be kept, because, and it's a weird moment we're in, because although I'm just going to be like, not pessimistic, but just maybe slightly realistic. We're in a really inspiring moment, but we're also in a moment where it's on the back of the state abusing its power, absolving itself of responsibility, and killing off 60,000 people, and in some ways laughing about it, right? And even the demands of Black Lives Matter were kind of mocked by the commission that was set up with Mirza and Phillips. I mean, this wasn't a "we'll listen to you" type vibe. This was haha, right? This was a haha moment. This was the Oxbridge elite basically turning to the rising up of British Black community with other communities coming together and saying the cause of Black Lives Matter really, really matters in the UK, and we want to talk about defunding the police and prison reform, and also the kind of years of neglect of society. And they went and put people who don't believe in institutional racism in charge of it, right? And if Trevor Phillips is brought on board, you're going to have someone who also believes in kind of cultural characteristics explaining everything. So I feel like the momentum will be carried forth in the fight that's coming, because I think we're going to be involved in a fight about what it is that the state has in responsibility towards us as citizens, and what we expect of the state and how we expect it to treat us. And they're kind of embroiled in all of this, because when we saw the breakdown of all of this, it was played on class lines, and also race and class lines intertwined together, and with gender. And I feel like that will be the calling for the momentum. And then the momentum will be, I think, as Sita's kind of mapped out really quite well, is how you shift that into organising and protest and organising towards a movement. Because believe it or not, I'm not being pessimistic. We are in for a battle with this government, right? They ain't going to give it up for 4.5 years with an 80 majority. Something cataclysmic has to happen, and 60,000 people dying doesn't seem to be cataclysmic. So I think it's a call to arms. There you go.
See, did you have anything to add to that? If not, I got a couple more questions. I'm working on reading. I have to read them out loud, sorry everyone. Okay, here we go. With Keir Starmer's disregard of the BLM movement, how do you think Black and Asian people will change their views on the current Labour Party? That's a good, juicy one. Timely.
Go for it, John.
Okay. Well, look, I'm not although my work kind of works in the kind of anachronistic, we get it all done by ourselves. I am fully aware of state power and the ability of state power. Look, the Labour Party's always been an interesting institution in that, like, it was, created to kind of represent Labour, right? Organised Labour. Organised Labour created a party to represent organised workers. And then Britain always had a bit of a problem because at some point it had to recognise that its workers weren't all white and weren't all in England, right? They came over. I think the Labour Party's had a historical problem dealing with anti-racism. It's, Clement Attlee didn't want new Commonwealth immigration to happen. Also, really, they didn't want to give the colonies back, but they were forced to do that by Black and brown people revolting and resisting. And, immigration and the perception that the white elements of the working class, the white members of the working class, are thoroughly racist, I think is actually embroiled in the Labour Party, maybe far more so than in the white working class communities, right? And we have to kind of disarticulate that the Labour Party does not have a direct kind of phone line to the white working class. They are not the same thing. So the Labour Party historically has had these problems. I fully expect it to keep having these problems. Even Corbynism had problems around immigration. For those of us who backed that project, and I always pitch it like this: anti-racism is a repository of knowledge and ideas of justice that necessarily do not have to sit in state power. We can organize, we can protest, and we should always do that kind of justice thing. We're all linked to that. For those of us who do anti-racism, we're linked into a kind of tradition of what justice and what class means and what race means and what our horizon should be. And I've seen it on social media and everyone going, I'm leaving the Labour Party. I'm just going to be like the fuddy-duddy here and say the state institution is still pivotal. And if people feel like they can stay and fight, and I know someone was taking the mickey out of that statement the other day, then they should do, because the Labour Party will be a vehicle to achieve stuff. It would be much easier for anti-racists to do things if Jeremy Corbyn had won. Let's just be honest about this. Whether a Keir Starmer government, and I think he is particularly good, and I think he may particularly win. He could win an election because I think he's that kind of neoliberal. But we shouldn't automatically say that the Labour Party isn't for us. But at the same time, we shouldn't be expecting the Labour Party to get the job done. It's never got the job done. So that's my take on it. It's a kind of halfway house. So it's not really an answer. Sorry.
Yeah, I'm in the same halfway house, unfortunately, which is that I think we might think of elections as choosing our enemies. So we might think of the election as choosing the state we want to fight under and the state we want to fight. So I would always choose to fight under a Jeremy Corbyn government. I would similarly choose to fight under Keir Starmer's government than I would Boris Johnson's, right? Like, I don't think that's a particularly controversial idea. I do think that one of the reasons not to sink your life into the Labour Party is that bureaucracies create bureaucrats rather than bureaucrats create bureaucracies. So if you constantly do everything in a bureaucratic organisation, you become a bureaucrat. And so there's just like, I think just like keeping that in mind is always worth it, just because if you spend all of your Thursday nights sitting in like long meetings in which people try and outmaneuver each other with process, your own mindset will start to become affected by that practice, but also you will literally lose hours of your life to the process. So the last time I did a thing like that, I really halfway through the meeting thought, one day I'll die and I'll have been in this meeting and I won't be able to explain that to myself. So I was like, I'm going to have to leave the meeting because it's just too unbearable. So like, look out for yourself in that. But we can't ignore institutions. We live in a society formed by institutions. So we're going to have to at least pay attention to the Labour Party. But at the moment, I really don't think that Keir Starmer has much cut through. And I'll give you an example. My family WhatsApp sent a message round and it referred to him as Keith Starmer. So my sense is that he has not yet like made it through, because I mean, it was I thought it was so funny. They were like, what's this Keith Starmer saying? And I was like, right, he's not called that. But
Is that the gauge?
I think
the
that's how
gauge of whether Sita's family know. That's the litmus test of like whether someone's entered into the mainstream. I love it. I'm going to do one more question and then we're just going to have a break. And then, because people have been asking, the breakout sessions are going to begin at 1:40 and I think you're automatically going to be hoisted into rooms. And then when those breakouts finish, you'll be hoisted back into the main room virtually. So it should be not too intrusive. So someone's asked, how do we move beyond fighting under parties and how do we mobilise the current movement to become activists for entire political form, like the abolition of the current electoral process, holding party campaigns, claims legally. And I'm just going to chuck this in. Someone said, what do you do with like shocking media? So I'll just throw that in because I think that's kind of linked as well, because they kind of work obviously in tandem together. But yeah, just a quick summary from both of you. Sita, you can go first, then John goes, and then any final musings that you have to the people who are in the chat, feel free to just.
I don't know what we do with the media. I've been wondering the same thing for the last few years. It feels like we live in a complete nightmare. I think those press conferences that were happening until recently made many people feel like they were losing their minds, and I was one of those people. I imagine many of you were too. So I do think creating our own alternatives obviously has to be key to that, and of course we have the capacity to do some of that on social media, but I also think what's really key is that we have conversations with people offline, privately, not on Twitter, not on social media, not on these platforms, because we cannot fight the power of the media with better media because we don't have the money. I do think that just has to be understood. So we have to form other kinds of expertise so that people, when they read the Daily Mail or whatever media it is, at this point the Guardian is pretty much the same problem, they have another source of authority in their lives that they process information through. So if someone trusts you, then when you say something to them, they don't just say, well, I read in the paper X, I read on the media X, right? So some of it is about saying that we have to fight the media through other means, through finding other sources of authority through which people can process their lives. And I think that kind of organizing, like, it's just like, it's boots on the ground, it's long, it takes time. But honestly, if you make a poster and put it up on a lamppost near your house, more people will see that don't know you than will ever see your tweet. So just like thinking about forms of communication that bypass the platforms and that bypass the media, the Oxbridge media, the corporate media. So I know it sounds kind of like long and boring, but I don't really see any other options other than like going back to basics, like doing the bread and butter stuff, talking to people, make you flyers, like do the stuff in your community. Because at a certain point, we have to understand that what people say, that thing, no justice, just us. Like, part of what that means is that we'd have to be creative and do ourselves.
Yeah, I would echo all of that. And I think the pitfalls of trying to create an alternative media platform, that there are examples where, I'm not going to name them, but, some groups emerge and they're very good. And then, but they have to join the media establishment. So, they go from from doing kind of online stuff to moving into mainstream media. And then there's a blurring of what the role is of that media now, right? What does it do? So I think Sita's work, kind of what she was outlaying there, is really key, and working in your community. And I think this partly is because, and this goes back to the question, how do we, because the person's question really is, how do we do revolution, right? The thing about, it really is like, how do we, yeah. So And my point to that is that any normal plan for a revolution never normally happens. Okay, so actually what we need to do is lay the groundwork for change, and I think this is what the future will hold in our communities, in our kind of future will be, how do we organize and educate amongst ourselves so that when the moment does turn up, and there will be fissures around crises and stuff, that people have the right responses. And I think that work is done in communities on a more local level. I mean, look, I write about the Black Panther Party. I have weird dreams that something would reemerge like that and it would cut across the nation and we would all be kind of creating alternative institutions. And then I wake up, right? And have to deal with the reality of austerity Britain and a really kind of, you know, harsh state that really doesn't care for people. So I feel like that organizing has to be done, and the revolutionary moment will happen through our kind of literal survival in these moments. And I think lots of people are surviving and getting through. One thing I would say is that I do like this idea. One of the things I've got from the coronavirus fallout is these Zoom meetings and things are actually attract a decent amount of people to lots of things. They don't come thousands, but we should retain elements of this form of communication beyond the moment, right? I think that's been quite key, is how can we link up struggles with the thing I was talking about earlier about solidarity. It is easy to kind of, if you've got the infrastructure, to get on one of these calls and start talking to people and exchanging ideas. So I feel like that actually is something we should retain. And someone rightfully points out that, yeah, the Black Panthers had media input. Yes, they had a newspaper, which was distributed for hundreds of thousands of copies per week. Again, I have dreams that would re-emerge. But until then, I'm all up for Sita's idea about the poster in the local community. So I think it's a great idea. These are the great ways we're going to do it. But yeah, if anyone else has the solution to revolutionary moments, please put it in the chat.
Yeah, love it. Yeah, as someone that used to run a magazine through Consented, I would not recommend it. It's bloody long, like an absolute nightmare. So don't do it if you're thinking about it, is my advice. But yeah, no, thank you for that. I'm sure everyone's given a virtual round of applause. I'm going to hit the clap emoji. So I'm doing one because that was a really good panel. But yeah, thank you, Sita and John, again. That was brilliant.